They called it the sound of thunder rolling across frozen earth. Soviet artillery crews in the winter of 1941 had grown accustomed to disappointment. Shell after shell screamed into German positions with little effect, scattering across vast distances, missing targets by hundreds of meters, wasting precious ammunition that supply trains could barely replace. The gunners watched through field glasses as their rounds exploded harmlessly in empty fields while enemy formations remained untouched, advancing with terrifying efficiency. Nobody could have predicted that within months, a single directive would transform these frustrated crews into the most devastating artillery force the world had ever witnessed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The transformation didn't come from new weapons or superior technology. It emerged from something far more unexpected, a complete reimagining of how artillery itself functioned on the battlefield. German commanders who had once laughed at the wild inaccuracy of Soviet bombardments would soon learn to fear the precision of batteries that could obliterate entire battalions in minutes. The change was so dramatic, so absolute, that intelligence officers initially refused to believe their own reports. How could the same guns that had failed so spectacularly suddenly achieve kill rates that defied every established doctrine of warfare? The story begins not with victory, but with catastrophe. When German forces crashed across the Soviet border in June 1941, they encountered an artillery arm that was impressive on paper, but catastrophic in practice. The Red Army possessed more guns than any military force in history. Thousands upon thousands of howitzers, field guns, and heavy mortars stretched across the vast expanse of the Eastern Front. Soviet doctrine had always emphasized mass, the belief that sheer volume of fire could compensate for any deficiency in accuracy or coordination. Planners in Moscow had calculated that if enough shells were fired, eventually some would find their targets. Reality proved devastatingly different. German troops advancing through Soviet territory quickly learned that artillery barrages, though terrifying in their noise and fury, posed surprisingly little actual danger. Shells landed scattered across enormous areas, their explosions random and uncoordinated. A German infantry company might hear the shriek of incoming rounds and dive for cover, only to watch the bombardment fall a kilometer away, churning up dirt and trees, but leaving the soldiers entirely unharmed. After the first few weeks, veteran Wehrmacht units barely bothered to take shelter during Soviet artillery strikes, recognizing them as more spectacle than threat. The reasons for this failure ran deep into the structure of Soviet military organization. Artillery batteries operated in isolation, each gun crew functioning as its own independent unit with minimal communication to neighboring positions. There were no standardized methods for calculating trajectories or adjusting fire based on observed results. Gun commanders estimated ranges by eye, factored in wind and weather according to personal judgment, and hoped their shells would land somewhere near the intended target. When batteries fired together, the result was chaos rather than concentration. Some guns might overshoot by half a kilometer, while others fell short by even greater distances, creating a scattered pattern that resembled random chance more than military precision. Communication between forward observers and gun positions was equally primitive. Officers watching enemy movements from the front lines had no reliable way to transmit targeting information to artillery units positioned kilometers behind them. Field telephones, when they worked at all, connected through lines that German advance parties cut with casual ease. Radio sets were scarce, temperamental, and operated by crews with minimal training who struggled to convey accurate grid coordinates under the stress of combat. By the time targeting information reached the guns, enemy formations had often moved to entirely different positions, rendering the data worthless.
The lack of standardized procedures meant that even when targeting information was accurate, gun crews interpreted it differently. One battery might use a coordinate system based on local landmarks, while another relied on compass bearings from a completely different reference point. Maps were outdated, poorly printed, and often failed to match the actual terrain. Artillery officers discovered that hills marked on their charts didn't exist in reality, or that rivers shown flowing in one direction actually curved in another. Firing solutions calculated from such flawed information produced results that were effectively random. German after-action reports from the summer of 1941 frequently noted the ineffectiveness of Soviet artillery. One German division commander wrote that his troops had been subjected to a barrage lasting 3 hours, involving an estimated 500 guns, yet casualties numbered fewer than 20 men.
The shells had fallen across such a wide area that most landed in uninhabited forest or open fields. Another report described Soviet batteries firing for an entire day at a railway junction without managing to damage a single meter of track. The Germans began to view Soviet artillery not as a serious threat, but as a logistical burden on their enemies, forcing the Soviets to transport and supply vast quantities of ammunition that produced negligible results. Soviet commanders recognized the crisis, but initially had no framework for understanding its causes. They blamed individual gun crews for incompetence, accused officers of sabotage, and demanded ever greater volumes of fire to compensate for poor accuracy. Artillery regiments received orders to double their rate of fire, then triple it, burning through ammunition stockpiles at catastrophic rates while achieving no improvement in effectiveness. Some batteries found themselves rationing shells not because of supply shortages, but because they had expended entire months' allocations in single engagements that accomplished nothing. The psychological toll on Soviet artillery crews was immense. Gunners who had trained for years found themselves unable to hit targets that should have been easy marks. They watched through field glasses as their shells exploded uselessly while German armor rolled forward untouched. Officers screamed contradictory orders, demanding impossible accuracy from guns that lacked basic fire control equipment. Morale plummeted as crews realized their efforts were futile, that they were burning through ammunition and wearing out gun barrels without inflicting meaningful damage on the enemy. By autumn of 1941, the Soviet artillery arm was in a state of quiet collapse. Units had lost faith in their own capabilities. Ammunition reserves were critically low. German forces had advanced so rapidly that many artillery regiments found themselves cut off behind enemy lines, their guns spiked and abandoned as crews fled on foot. The dream of overwhelming the enemy through massed firepower had proven to be an illusion built on fundamentally flawed assumptions about how modern artillery warfare actually functioned. What the Soviets needed was not more guns or more shells, but a complete revolution in how artillery operated as a system. The answer would come from an unexpected source, a directive so simple in its concepts, yet so radical in its implementation that it would reshape warfare itself. But before that transformation could occur, Soviet high command had to first accept a bitter truth. Everything they believed about artillery warfare was wrong. The crisis reached its breaking point in December 1941, during the desperate defense of Moscow. Soviet forces had managed to halt the German advance through sheer determination and the arrival of Siberian reinforcements. But artillery support remained tragically ineffective. Batteries fired thousands of rounds in support of counterattacks, yet German positions remained largely intact. The disconnect between the massive expenditure of ammunition and the minimal results finally forced senior commanders to confront the systemic failures that had plagued Soviet artillery since the war's beginning. Marshal Nikolai Voronov, chief of Soviet artillery, assembled a team of officers and technical specialists to investigate the problem. What they discovered was worse than anyone had imagined. The issues weren't isolated failures of individual units, but represented fundamental flaws in every aspect of artillery operations. There were no standardized firing tables, no reliable methods for coordinating multiple batteries, no effective system for adjusting fire based on observation. Soviet artillery, despite its massive size,
functioned more like a medieval army hurling stones at city walls than a modern military force employing precision firepower. Voronov's team worked through the winter, interviewing gun crews, studying German artillery doctrine captured from prisoners, and conducting firing tests that revealed the staggering inaccuracy of current methods. They calculated that Soviet batteries were achieving hit rates of less than 2%, meaning that 98 shells out of every 100 fired were completely wasted. The economic and logistical implications were staggering. The Soviet Union was manufacturing millions of artillery shells at enormous cost, transporting them thousands of kilometers by rail and truck, only to have them explode uselessly in empty terrain. The solution, when it finally emerged, was radical in its simplicity. Rather than trying to improve individual gun crews or manufacture more sophisticated weapons, Voronov proposed creating an entirely new system that would turn scattered batteries into a unified, coordinated force. The concept centered on three interconnected innovations.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. First, the establishment of rigid firing procedures that every artillery unit would follow without deviation. Second, the creation of a centralized fire control network that could coordinate multiple batteries to concentrate their fire on single targets. Third, the deployment of specially trained forward observation teams equipped with reliable communications gear and standardized methods for calling in strikes. The proposal met fierce resistance from traditionalists, who viewed the emphasis on procedure and coordination as undermining the initiative of individual commanders. Some argued that the complexity of the new system would be impossible to implement across the millions of men serving in Soviet artillery units. Others worried that centralizing fire control would create bottlenecks that would slow response times to battlefield developments. The debate consumed weeks as German forces continued their advance and Soviet casualties mounted. What finally convinced Stalin and the Soviet High Command was a demonstration conducted in late January 1942. Voronov assembled 3 artillery batteries using the new procedures and fired on a test range representing German defensive positions. The results were extraordinary. Shells that had previously scattered across kilometers of terrain now fell in tight groups, obliterating targets with mechanical precision. Hit rates jumped from 2% to over 60% in some trials. The same 3 batteries that had failed to damage a single target using old methods now destroyed mock fortifications, vehicles, and troop concentrations with devastating efficiency. The order went out in early February 1942. Every Soviet artillery unit was to immediately adopt the new firing procedures. Officers who resisted would be removed from command. Training programs were established to teach the new methods. Technical manuals were printed by the millions and distributed to gun crews across the entire front. The transformation of Soviet artillery had officially begun, though few yet understood just how completely it would reshape the character of the war. The implementation of the new artillery doctrine began with something as mundane as paperwork, yet it would prove more revolutionary than any technological advancement. Every gun crew received a standardized firing manual bound in weather-resistant covers, its pages filled with mathematical tables, procedural checklists, and detailed diagrams. For artillery officers accustomed to estimating ranges by instinct and adjusting fire through trial and error, the rigid formality of these manuals felt alien, almost insulting to their professional judgment. The manuals dictated everything from the precise angle of gun barrels to the exact powder charges needed for specific ranges, eliminating personal discretion in favor of mathematical certainty. Gunners discovered that the new system treated artillery not as an art requiring intuition, but as a science demanding exact replication of proven methods. Each firing table had been calculated through hundreds of test shots under controlled conditions, accounting for variables like temperature, humidity, barrel wear, and ammunition variations. Where commanders once shouted estimates across firing positions, they now consulted dense columns of numbers that specified trajectory calculations down to fractions of degrees. The psychological shift was profound. Artillery officers who had spent decades developing their craft suddenly found their accumulated experience rendered obsolete by 19-year-old technicians armed with slide rules and reference charts. The resistance to these changes was immediate and visceral. Senior officers complained that the new procedures stripped artillery of its flexibility, turning dynamic combat into mechanical routine. They argued that battlefield conditions changed too rapidly for rigid adherence to predetermined firing solutions. During the first weeks of implementation, numerous battery commanders simply ignored the new manuals, continuing to operate according to their established habits. Some openly mocked the technical language and mathematical precision, claiming that real warfare could never be reduced to formulas and tables. Voronov responded with ruthless efficiency. Officers who refused to implement the new procedures were relieved of command and reassigned to infantry units. Entire batteries that failed to adopt standardized methods found themselves broken up and redistributed among compliant units. The message was unmistakable. The old ways had failed catastrophically, and there would be no tolerance for those who clung to discredited doctrines. Within weeks, resistance began to crumble as officers realized that career survival depended on mastering the new system regardless of their personal opinions about its merits. The second major innovation involved the creation of centralized fire direction centers that could coordinate multiple batteries simultaneously. Prior to this reform, each artillery battery operated independently, selecting its own targets and firing according to its commander's judgment. The new system established control posts staffed by specially trained officers who received targeting requests from forward observers, calculated firing solutions for multiple batteries, and directed coordinated strikes that concentrated fire from dozens of guns onto single points. These fire direction centers represented a fundamental reconceptualization of how artillery functioned, transforming scattered independent units into components of a unified system. The technical challenges of implementing centralized fire control were immense. Control posts needed reliable communications with both forward observers and gun batteries, requiring the installation of telephone networks and radio equipment across vast stretches of territory. Map coordination became critical, as all units needed to reference the same grid system to ensure that targeting data translated accurately from observation posts to fire direction centers to gun positions. Soviet cartographers worked frantically to produce standardized maps that replaced the hodgepodge of local charts that artillery units had previously used. Every battery received identical map sheets marked with numbered grid squares, creating a common reference framework that enabled precise coordination. Forward observers underwent intensive training in the new procedures for calling in artillery strikes. Gone were the vague reports of enemy positions somewhere near a particular village or forest. Observers now transmitted exact grid coordinates, estimated target dimensions, and assessments of whether targets were stationary or mobile. They learned standardized terminology for describing terrain features, ensuring that their reports could be interpreted consistently by fire direction centers. Most critically, observers received training in adjusting fire based on where shells actually landed, providing real-time corrections that allowed batteries to walk their fire onto targets with devastating accuracy. The transformation to forward observation teams represented one of the most significant yet overlooked aspects of the artillery revolution. These teams, typically consisting of an officer and 2 or 3 enlisted specialists, positioned themselves as close to enemy lines as possible, often within a few hundred meters of German positions. Armed with powerful field glasses, radio sets, and detailed maps, they became the eyes of the entire artillery system. Their ability to accurately identify targets, calculate grid coordinates, and transmit information under combat conditions determined whether the new system would succeed or fail. Training programs for observers emphasized speed and precision. Officers practiced estimating distances by comparing objects of known size, learned to account for terrain features that might affect shell trajectories, and drilled endlessly on radio procedures until they could transmit targeting data while under fire without hesitation or error. The psychological demands were extraordinary. Observers needed to maintain ice-cold composure while German machine gun fire raked their positions, calmly speaking grid coordinates into radio handsets as mortars exploded around them. Many didn't survive their first engagements,
but those who did became some of the most valuable specialists in the entire Soviet military. The coordination between observers, fire direction centers, and gun batteries created a feedback loop that previous artillery doctrine had entirely lacked. An observer would identify a target and transmit its coordinates to the fire direction center. Officers at the center would calculate firing solutions and transmit orders to multiple batteries, specifying the exact angle, elevation, and powder charge for each gun. The batteries would fire, and the observer would watch where the shells landed. If they missed, the observer transmitted corrections, the fire direction center recalculated, and the batteries adjusted. This cycle could repeat multiple times until shells began landing directly on target, at which point all batteries would fire for effect, concentrating dozens or even hundreds of rounds onto a precise point. The efficiency gains were staggering. Where Soviet artillery had once required hours of scattered, ineffective fire to suppress a German position, the new system could achieve the same result in minutes with a fraction of the ammunition. Batteries that had burned through 1,000 shells to destroy a single enemy strongpoint now accomplished the task with fewer than 100 rounds, leaving them with reserve ammunition for additional targets. The economic implications were profound. The same logistical network that had struggled to keep guns supplied under the old wasteful system now found itself able to support far more intensive operations while actually reducing ammunition consumption. German forces first encountered the transformed Soviet artillery during the spring offensives of 1942. Wehrmacht commanders who had grown complacent about Soviet firepower suddenly found their positions subjected to barrages of terrifying precision. Shells that had once fallen scattered across wide areas now arrived in tight concentrations, obliterating foxholes, destroying vehicles, and shredding infantry formations. The change was so dramatic that German intelligence initially suspected the Soviets had deployed some new type of guided munition or radar-directed fire control system. Interrogation of captured Soviet artillery crews revealed the truth. The transformation had nothing to do with superior technology, but resulted entirely from improved procedures and coordination.
The psychological impact on German troops was immediate and severe. Soldiers who had learned to ignore Soviet artillery now found themselves desperately digging deeper foxholes and bunkers. Units that had previously maintained exposed positions withdrew to more concealed locations. The casual contempt that Wehrmacht forces had held for Soviet firepower evaporated, replaced by genuine fear. After-action reports from German commanders began describing Soviet artillery as their most serious threat, more dangerous than tanks, aircraft, or infantry assaults. Soviet artillery officers experienced their own psychological transformation, though in the opposite direction. Gun crews who had spent months firing blindly and uselessly now watched through field glasses as their shells demolished targets with mechanical precision. The frustration and demoralization that had plagued Soviet artillery gave way to fierce professional pride. Crews competed to see who could achieve hits with the fewest adjustment rounds. Battery commanders who had once dreaded combat now eagerly sought opportunities to demonstrate their newfound effectiveness. The transformation in morale was as important as the improvements in technical performance. The new system also enabled entirely new tactical possibilities. Centralized fire control allowed Soviet commanders to mass artillery fire in ways that had been impossible under the old decentralized system. A fire direction center could coordinate 50 batteries to simultaneously strike a single German defensive position, delivering the firepower of hundreds of guns onto a target area measuring just a few hundred square meters. The resulting devastation was apocalyptic, erasing fortifications, destroying equipment, and annihilating defenders in seconds. German positions that could have withstood days of scattered bombardment under the old system ceased to exist within minutes under coordinated strikes directed by the new procedures. Soviet doctrine began evolving to exploit these capabilities. Artillery preparation before infantry assaults became shorter but vastly more intense. Rather than firing for hours in hopes that some shells would hit German positions, batteries now delivered precise, overwhelming strikes that systematically dismantled enemy defenses in carefully planned sequences. Forward observers directed fire onto machine gun nests, then mortar positions, then command bunkers, each target receiving exactly the concentration of shells needed to destroy it before fire shifted to the next objective. Infantry advancing behind these barrages encountered not battered but still functional German positions, but lunar landscapes where nothing remained alive. The transformation extended beyond the purely technical aspects of artillery employment. The new system required unprecedented levels of coordination between different branches of the Soviet military. Infantry commanders had to synchronize their assaults with artillery fire plans. Tank units needed to coordinate with forward observers to avoid friendly fire. Air Force liaison officers worked with fire direction centers to prevent aircraft from flying through areas about to be subjected to bombardment. This forced integration of previously isolated military branches began creating a more cohesive combined arms approach to warfare that amplified the effectiveness of every Soviet combat unit. By summer of 1942, the transformation was complete. Soviet artillery had evolved from the least effective component of the Red Army into its most devastating weapon. The same guns that had fired uselessly for months now achieved kill rates that exceeded even pre-war projections of what modern artillery could accomplish. German forces that had once advanced with impunity through Soviet barrages now found their offensives halted by firepower so concentrated and accurate that movement became suicidal. The artillery revolution had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, proving that victory in modern warfare belonged not to those with the most advanced technology, but to those who could most effectively organize and employ the weapons they already possessed. Yet the true measure of the transformation would only become apparent during the massive battles still to come, when Soviet artillery would demonstrate capabilities that military theorists had believed impossible. The foundation had been laid through standardized procedures, centralized coordination, and trained forward observers, but the full potential of the new system remained untested. That test would come soon enough, in battles where Soviet artillery would not merely support other arms, but become the decisive instrument of victory, reshaping the character of warfare on the Eastern Front and establishing principles that would influence military doctrine for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.